Has it started recording? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Today is October 19th, and this is SIG architecture meeting. Welcome, everybody. Is there anybody new here that would like to introduce themselves? Please let us know. Hi, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll go and say hi.
Hi.
My name is Jonathan. This is my first time at a SIG Arch meeting, and I'm a maintainer carpenter, and I work over at AWS.
Welcome, Jonathan. Anybody else?
This is Victor. I'm not sure. I think I attended this meeting before. I'm mostly just a listener, so.
Oh, please. It doesn't matter. Please introduce yourself.
Independent, just actually new to a lot of these things, just learning.
Thanks. Hi, Victor.
And I'm Ellis, also working on the Carpenter project over at AWS, working very closely with Jonathan.
Hi, Ellis. I see a couple of autopilots. Is that somebody's AI tool kicking in? No idea. Is that real people or AI?
I don't see those. Where does it say that? Is that the name of the person in?
Yeah, Lalit's autopilot and
Autopilot. Oh, I
and there's
see.
two of them. So, well, we'll keep an eye out. Hey, Sergey. Hi, Wojtek.
Hey.
Okay, let's get started. Jonathan, you have the first item on the agenda. Please go ahead and share an update of where you are with the discussions with autoscaling, and like set the whole stage, because I don't think everybody on the call knows what is happening. A few of us know all the details, but I think it's better to give a view to everybody, saying here is what is happening.
Sure. Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, so Carpenter is a open source autoscaling project that was originally developed by AWS, and it's gained a lot of, I guess, traction over the last couple of years. And as a result of that, one thing that we've been wanting to do has been to be able to donate the project to upstream Kubernetes, and specifically to SIG autoscaling. And so as part of that donation, we, like Alice, actually opened an issue in the Kubernetes community, and that's been gaining a lot of traction, a lot of good feedback. We've been discussing with the SIG chairs over the last couple of months around what that alignment should look like. And part of the discussion there was basically, CAS currently exists within SIG autoscaling. Carpenter would exist as another autoscaling project inside of SIG autoscaling that would have, similarity in scope, but differences in API surface and differences in maybe behaviors currently today. And so part of the discussion, in order to kind of, allow that process to go forward and to not confuse users when both projects would exist inside of SIG autoscaling, was can we align on behaviors, and can we align on certain API surfaces that would affect application workloads potentially? So there's certain API surface that exists within both CAS and Carpenter today that's basically the same behavior, but just has different annotations or different labels or things that are associated with it. And so part of that conversation moved into, okay, let's talk about aligning on these details and kind of come to a shared solution on what would be best for users, so that users that are trying to either run both at the same time in their cluster, or trying to move between the two different solutions, can have an easy time doing it, and they can reason about a single concept. So what kind of dovetailed out of that conversation is this Google Doc here, which is the alignment doc, and we've been iterating on it quite a bit over the last couple months. What we've eventually come to is the, if you scroll down, there's a few, I guess, action items that we kind of aligned on as a result of those discussions. Some of them are short term and affect kind of, I guess, SIG autoscaling in the immediate term, prior or in parallel with Carpenter joining the SIG. And then some of them have been kind of allocated as long-term items. And the long-term items are things that we want to discuss mainly with SIG architecture, because they have a lot of overlap with other SIGs. So there's some certain specific details around, like CAS currently today basically only handles node autoscaling, and it basically hands off the node lifecycle management to the cloud provider. Carpenter has quite a bit more scope with respect to node lifecycle management. For instance, like we will roll and upgrade nodes on behalf, like as part of the Carpenter project. We'll expire nodes due to security vulnerabilities, things like this. So we will actually manage that whole lifecycle of the nodes. And so we were trying to basically figure out like, okay, if we're going to either align on an API surface, or even just introduce a separate API surface for Carpenter, like where do we live in terms of like an API group? So right now we're in Carpenter.sh, but we'd ideally like to be in like a Kubernetes.io namespace once we end up inside of SIG autoscaling, which for all intents and purposes, like we're still waiting on lazy consensus, but at least from the SIG autoscaling side, like the chairs have said that we're okay to go forward, assuming no one has any issues over the next couple of weeks with that. But one thing that we think would be good would basically be if Carpenter could, because we're handling node lifecycle management, could Carpenter be in this namespace that's called like node lifecycle.kubernetes.io or something like this. But then, as you might imagine, that has quite a bit of overlap with other SIGs. So there's that discussion, as well as there's a discussion around how we really like to align between CAS and Carpenter on like how we behave with downscaling and how we handle like graceful termination of nodes. And I also recognize there's like a cap that's open right now, for instance, that is covering like declarative node draining, and we're quite interested in that because we'd like to ideally have CAS and Carpenter and maybe just Kubernetes in general have like a single mechanism by which that's kind of like the go-to generalized mechanism by which nodes are drained. So there's like a couple, mainly like API surface and how we handle graceful node termination, that we'd really like to see like just generic upstream alignment on. So there's like an initial thought and proposal that's sitting inside of this document, but as we're going through this process, we realized that like, okay, if we just like scope this document to just auto scaling, we're going to have like a very short-sighted approach to this that I think we should probably generalize more into the upstream ecosystem and involve a bunch of different SIGs. So I think ideally what we'd like to propose is like one, like initial thoughts on those items that there's basically 2 items that I laid out, and then trying to see if there's room here to perhaps form a working group that kind of dovetails out of this conversation that we could have with SIG node and SIG cluster lifecycle and SIG autoscaling around these things that we'd like to see upstream alignment on.
Okay, I think that's quite a bit of information.
Yeah.
Let us give the team here a minute to digest it. Any questions? Where do we start?
I mean, I think my first question would be, so there are lots of different ecosystem projects that approach some of these problems, right? Different, like, I mean, Cluster API is already a Kubernetes project, right? It's an ecosystem project, but I don't know that its API groups are even Kubernetes.io or Kates.io, right? They may be extended or something. Like, I guess my question is like, we have to be very careful about what we do. All right, let's step back. There's the scope of Kubernetes. What's within scope of the Kubernetes project itself? And traditionally, this sort of thing has been, and it's been the SIG cluster lifecycle that's managed the node provisioning process. I'm not talking about auto scaling. You're sort of covering both of those 2 SIGs, which we currently have as 2 separate functions. I don't know if architecturally they're 2 separate functions within your project, or you could separate them in that way, and so that might be useful if you really want to join the project. But I guess my question is, why does it belong in the Kubernetes project as opposed to in the ecosystem? And there's 2 aspects there's a further aspect of, even if it's in the Kubernetes project, it's unlikely that given our current conformance program, it would become anything in conformance because it would be considered an optional feature. So I don't know how familiar you are with our conformance program, but it essentially it's got a kind of a small kernel of what you have to agree to what you have to support in order to be able to use Kubernetes. So I'm trying to understand there's actually a lot of downsides to becoming part of the Kubernetes project, right? Like, it's a massive amount of, basically it's the Kubernetes project taking on responsibility for maintaining all of your code and all of the APIs. So there's downside for the project, but there's downside for you too, because now you're subject to our API review, you're subject to our production readiness review, you're subject to all our processes. So I just want to understand what the thinking is beyond we think it'd be cool to be part of Kubernetes and we'd like things to be consistent, because they're already not consistent. There's already many different tools for doing this. I'm not sure we're not going to pick one, you know. So can you give some clarification on that sort of thing?
Ellis, do you want to take that, or Jonathan?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. I think, you know, in the Jonathan's preamble, we'd kind of talked about two areas of scope. One is some node lifecycle flows like cording and draining that we think probably should belong in the Kubernetes project. And that may not even have an implementation, and it may just be the definition of a standard that there end up being multiple implementations of in different projects. And then there's also the Carpenter specific APIs. And those, I think, are two different questions about whether or not they live in the same place. From our perspective, we already integrate, like our customers are aware, a Carpenter customer is aware of like the topology.kubernetes.io domain. It's aware of the kubernetes.io domain. It's already kind of interacting with a couple different pieces of Kubernetes. And so I don't think it would be the end of the world if we implemented some upstream concepts for node lifecycle, even if Carpenter's CRDs weren't themselves in node lifecycle. And I really appreciate you calling out the downsides of, you know, being part of the Kubernetes.io project proper, as opposed
as Jordan said, that are actually all beneficial. There's no downside, but they can be painful.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well as like we're obviously very excited about Carpenter. Our customers are very excited about Carpenter. It's very much on the adoption path. I'm kind of curious, maybe just as a aside or corollary to this question is there a way to treat it as an ecosystem project for now with a longer term path to becoming part of conformance? Like right now, there's one cloud provider implementation. Azure's been working on one, but it's not publicly available yet. But they've been talking about it publicly for several months now. If we end up achieving very, very broad adoption, is that something that once the project is kind of already in its V1 state, that there's still a path? Or is this kind of like a decision point essentially where we would say, this is an ecosystem project and will always be an ecosystem project?
So Derek, I see your hand, but let me just reply to this question. So I want to differentiate between part of the Kubernetes project and part of conformance. Very different things. Tons of things. RBAC is not part of conformance, right? It's definitely part of our expectations for Kubernetes, but there are it's not a required feature that you need to run in your cluster. It's not a required API to be called Kubernetes. So that's a really different topic. And I brought it up because I want to make sure people are clear on even if you were part of the project, it doesn't mean every cloud provider or every distribution of Kubernetes would support these APIs unless it's part of conformance. Becoming part of conformance is a very high bar. Because we've failed repeatedly. I attempted it, others attempted it before me. We repeatedly failed to build out the conformance program to have optional functionality, like multiple badges. It's just one badge now. It's Kubernetes or not. So as far as this being definitive, nothing's ever definitive, but like all these things change. I think that most things right now become CNCF projects rather than becoming part of the Kubernetes project, unless they're sort of born out of the SIG. But I don't know. I'll let Derek see if he has what his thoughts are.
I just want to make a couple comments. I was trying to think about how to evaluate the proposal here, and I wanted to maybe suggest that we separate the node lifecycle signaling termination flows from maybe the core of what I think your proposal was looking at. Just for those who may not know, like there are folks who've come to SIG to suggest a way to signal like Kubernetes controlled drain, and I think that's what you're looking at here, Dims. And we have given feedback in the SIG meeting to this concept. And I think one of my key concerns of feedback was just like, how does this change the privilege model of a cluster? And I think we can make progress on this independent of evaluating the Carpenter project. And the only other thing I would note is just maybe to echo John's earlier point, you reference related projects that with my Red Hat hat on, I know are shipped in the Red Hat ecosystem, but they are also optional. So for example, like that node maintenance operator is not on every OpenShift cluster in the world. It's only on those environments where it made sense, I guess. And so from that perspective, like I think whether Carpenter was evaluated to be inclusive of these use cases, like from my own experience with our OpenShift distribution, the things you linked here aren't in every OpenShift cluster either, nor should we have the expectation that they're in every Kubernetes cluster. And so hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, and maybe to clarify, Jonathan, you could probably make this point as well, as I don't think the expectation is in any, I don't even think that the goal here is to make this like this, have them promoted from CRDs to core APIs, right? Something that's part of, shipped directly as part of Kubernetes. If you provide Kubernetes, you must provide a Carpenter implementation. I think that one is, maybe the best counterexample would be like on-prem, where you don't have a dynamically scaling environment. But maybe just to kind of like bring the conversation back to the scope that we are targeting. I think we're aligned on the idea that like maybe cord and drain is something that we can carve out that is part of our core and conformance. And then there's the separate question of like, where does our project live? And then I guess specifically for the Cass and Carpenter question, where is the shared behaviors of Cass and Carpenter? Is how much of that, if any, can be kind of part of conformance, I guess, or promoted to be part of how, or not even necessarily part of conformance, but promoted to be part of the kind of a Kubernetes well-known namespace.
Yeah, let's do Jordan and then Jonathan.
Just gonna talk about like 3 dimensions. Like one is if there are pieces like building blocks inside Kubernetes that are deficient. That's a great thing to bring to like SIG node. So Derek already talked about that. Whether that means building out existing APIs or even just defining like, here's how you use the existing API. Here's how SIG node recommends it and expects it and tests it, and patterns around that. It might mean new API surface, but sort of those primitives that would serve this use case, but could also serve other use cases. And like presumably everybody is calling eviction API in a bunch of different ways and doing a bunch of different things. Like standardizing some of that seems beneficial. So that seems like something that is absolutely within like SIG node scope. If you wanted to have sort of optional SIG sponsored projects that are, if there was interest like in auto scaling, there's mechanisms for that. Some projects of SIGs, there's a link to the cluster API uses the experimental API. So x-k8s.io is sort of a k8s adjacent APIs that SIGs can play around in and like have things that are sponsored by SIGs, but don't have to go through all of the like full official API review processes. So it's more lightweight. The x-k8s is like experimental k8s. So it's kind of a mix of like prototype stuff, throwaway alpha stuff, but then also longer lived stuff like cluster API is under there as well. So it's kind of a grab bag. If you were going to do something sponsored by a SIG that wasn't necessarily going to be like a first class built-in API, that's probably where it would live. And then I guess the question about like a working group, like a lot of the things you're talking about do intersect, like scheduling and auto scaling and node. Like those 3 are are going to need to be involved for anything useful to happen. So a working group could be a reasonable thing to do there. But the guidance around working groups is that there's like a concrete deliverable, like what are they trying to achieve? And so they sort of come together, bring those SIGs together, achieve that thing, and terminate. And then like whatever the artifacts are, get handed off to some SIGs to own. So you kind of need an idea of who's going to own the output of this working group. So I'm not sure if that matches here. Like obviously those three SIGs, their input is needed, their involvement is needed. It's not obvious what the artifacts would be and who would own them once the working group was sort of done. But those are things to think about.
Jonathan?
Oh, what else, Chairman? I think you wanted to chime in. Or no? You unmuted.
Oh, I wasn't going to jump the queue, but now that you've called on me, I guess the direct question in response to that is like, what happens if something doesn't quite fit in the existing SIG structure, which is I think where we're at right now is like node lifecycle has traditionally been something owned by cloud providers as opposed to Kubernetes core, like node pools, et cetera. There's no concept of a node pool in Kubernetes, but node pool would be part of node lifecycle. And that's largely the responsibility area that we, and even cluster autoscaler kind of are intersecting. If we decided that the scope of these things didn't quite make sense under node, like how would you go about trying to create a new structure that starts to take on some of this responsibility that has classically not been handled by the Kubernetes project directly?
So I think I'll take that. I think that where you would start is looking at the existing SIGs and see if pieces of it map, right? So like I think that things like node pools and node provisioning does fall within the scope of cluster lifecycle. And then of course there's an interface between the node resource and how the signaling is done from VM, right? Separating VMs and nodes or machines, not even VMs, machines and nodes, right? A node is a sort of projection of some compute resource into the Kubernetes ecosystem. And there's going to be some signaling between how, okay, so yeah, you've got this idea of claim, right? So like, exactly. So that kind of thing, I think, would fall within the scope of cluster lifecycle as it stands today. If you look at cluster API, which comes out of there, it provisions machines and nodes and all these things. So with different providers, so it's not a clean fit of your whole scope into any one SIG. It's unfortunately a disaggregation of your scope into multiple SIGs, but that might be, the working group would have to figure out how to do that.
At this point, it is like, what is the best SIG to start with? And then like, which SIGs do you work with? And then which working groups do you need to set up? Just giving the basic, bring all the people in is what we are trying to do here. Machik, sorry, you had held your hand up for a while and you dropped it just now. Did you want to talk?
I do, but I think I have slightly different topics, so maybe I'll let this part of the discussion play out and then continue.
Right. So just to wrap that up there, I don't think the SIG itself needs sign off from SIG architecture if the SIG chooses to. I think there is an open PR and we'll let that consensus build there. And then please go take a look at that and do a +1 or raise your concern there. And I think then Machik and Graham and SIG autoscaling chairs can take a look at the feedback there and see what needs to be done there. I guess this is a heads up that things are coming, right? And there is lots of discussion that we need to do, and we'll have to figure out like which pieces go where and who needs to be involved and what kind of work can be done, those kinds of things. So I think I'll stop right there. Go back to
So
yes, John.
I just had a further suggestion before we get into metrics. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how familiar you are with the Gateway API, but the Gateway API has been built over the last several years.
Yep.
And is a really good example of bringing together different providers on a common API with extensibility. So what you're looking at here is you're crossing a few different, right? You're like, okay, well, we do some auto scaling, right? So we're going to work with the auto scaling SIG to come up with a common API and set of expectations around the behavior of that API, even if cluster autoscale is one implementation and Carpenter is another implementation. And in fact, Google has its own internal implementations, right? Like we do that already. That's a common pattern within Kubernetes. And it sounds like you're working with Magic and team, and that's awesome. No issue there whatsoever. You can do the similar thing in cluster lifecycle, and you can say, hey, we've got this node claim thing, you've got machine sets, you've got like, how do we make all these things? Should we come up with, I don't know, come up with a common API, but it's going to be up to that SIG. Like Dim said, it's not really, they don't need to come to us for approval. They're their own co-equal entity. And so that's going to be up to them. But I mean, in the end, there's the API review group here, right? That's gonna have some real opinions.
Yeah, this group will end up, you will come here to say, hey, here is the annotations, labels, whatever, right? That are under your purview. Here is what we are trying to do, and do a cap and follow the processes. Like PRR is a big deal for us for sure. So that's basically what you're looking at.
Yeah, and what is appropriate, and I'm glad you came here, is that decide what's within scope of Kubernetes. That's within the purview of this group, right. And it's clear, like you are within scope. You're just spanning multiple SIGs. For the most, I don't know your details of your project, but from what you're describing, right, I've heard great things about Carpenter, but like, so that would be my suggestion: is study what they've done, because they also have built out an entire conformance program for Gateway API. So even though it's an optional functionality that not every Kubernetes distribution has to support, that if you do support it, then they've defined certain sets of behaviors that you need to follow, and they've got a much better conformance program than we do for Kubernetes overall, right? Like, and so like to take a look at what they've done there, I think you could learn from it and sort of work on planning from there.
Okay, Machi?
So I think a lot of what I wanted to mention was already sort of covered by other people, but I think separately from this broader discussion, right? I think from cluster autoscaler side, I think we're in slightly different position in node autoscaling space, just because as far as I know, there are only 2 projects. So this gives us, I think, better opportunity to create some sort of standard that is essentially implemented by all the autoscaling projects. And I think that from perspective of SIG autoscaling is kind of a large part of the motivation. And I'd be interested to know if, like, even without naming a specific project, but having like Kubernetes concepts around node autoscaling, where we define kind of the expected behaviors of autoscaler and how this is related to scheduling and so on, would be something that makes sense.
Any response, anyone?
Maybe, can I summarize what I think I heard? Because I'm not sure. You're saying because there's only 2 ones, you're in a good position to standardize on the behaviors and expectations. I unfortunately
basically, yes.
glanced
So
over and read this chat
like
message at the same time, so I missed part of what you said. I have to admit, I'm sorry about that.
Yes, so but I think you summed it up pretty well. There isn't very much API surface to something like cluster autoscaler, because the API surface really is pod resource requests, node selectors, and so on, all of those scheduling mechanisms. And for the most part, like that's also true for Carpenter. It has its own API service that goes beyond cluster autoscaler, but this part is basically shared by both projects. And so standardizing, or like at least like having some sort of written expectation and like concepts page and things like this around just what's the general expected behavior of node autoscaling as a concept is, I think would be something that SIG autoscaling would be quite interested in order to basically avoid what we have with other areas where there are a lot of projects that do the same thing in different ways. And then we don't really have an API service in the sense of API objects, but we have some concepts like annotations or like startup tains or like kind of very small things. And again, like standardizing on those things in some way would be, I think, helpful just to make it easier even to migrate or use different projects in this space, since all the existing projects basically share those concepts.
Absolutely. Like you can also expand this to like the tracing and metrics and other things as well going forward, right? Two is better than one. Otherwise, it's you are the implementation and you are the default. So everybody just does that because somebody just wrote it that way. This way, there is more discussion and hopefully fresh blood into the SIG, and maybe even take a look at the charter at some point to see if there is anything that needs to be done there, I think. So I have a feeling that this is a good thing. I would like to give this a chance and see where it goes. Okay. Ellis, any last words before we can switch to Rihan's topics?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to like put a takeaway for me, I think is, I think broadly what we're talking about, and there's some theory for future areas like over provisioning, but I think currently all of the scope, kind of to Maciek's point, that we both, as kind of the two implementations today, that we're trying to align on is this cordon drain thing. And there's a cap right now for how should scheduling preferences work with autoscalers, and that's being solved in SIG scheduling with exploring a new pod, new piece of the pod spec to handle that. I do wonder if we really just carve out that one piece and say, maybe this is a SIG node responsibility. It's about coordinating and terminating a node. We can roughly kind of draw those lines around SIG node. I think autoscaling and cluster lifecycle need to be part of the discussion, but it doesn't seem crazy that would live in the kind of node scope. And then at that point, the remaining scope of this question that we have here is, where do Carpenter's APIs live? And I think what I've heard is that it's acceptable, I guess, for us to live under the Kubernetes.io namespace that's decoupled from whether or not we're part of conformance. But if we're part of a SIG, we could do something like carpenter.kubernetes.io, and our specific concepts could live there. And then as we find additional areas of alignment with CAS, we can either identify existing SIGs where that behavior should live, or I guess come back to explore this question of scope not modeled by Kubernetes.
I'm a little hesitant to say Carpenter.Kubernetes. Like typically our API groups are sort of centered around functions. So like networking or whatever. Like is that? I guess I would ask Jordan. I'm sorry, I'm jumping. I just wanted to reply to that. From a node perspective, Derek is here. He's going to answer. But Jordan, from the API group perspective, what do you think about that? What are our rules?
They're generally function oriented. There are SIGs that span multiple API groups, so it's not a one-to-one like SIG to API group thing. It's generally grouped by function. I would say we're not super principled about the group names we choose. Some of that is sort of dictated by implementation constraints, like CRDs have to be in different groups than built-in types. So there have definitely been times when,
but like a Carpenter dot would sort of imply it's like for lack of a better term, a brand name, right? It's a project name. It's a set of arbitrary set of functionality that happens to go under a moniker. I don't think typically we've done that. It's like more like more specific function based. Is that accurate?
I mean, projects have groups. So like customization, Customize has a
Okay. All right.
named that. So yeah, I think
if you have a precedent, then you just follow the precedent, right?
Yeah.
But what I would also say is, don't we can't give you a catch-all answer here, unless you should bring it up as we go along, and like focused things, and then we can like figure out like where what exactly the name should be, right?
To be clear, I would love for it to live under something like node lifecycle.kubernetes. I think that's
Totally,
the like
totally,
right
yes.
message I want to send to our customers, but it also, I think, squatting that namespace carries a bar, I think, that would require something like conformance.
Well, you'd end up basically coming to a new set of APIs that everybody agrees on,
Yeah.
and migrating to those, right? As opposed to directly taking your API. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump
it's
in
okay,
too
I'll
fast.
jump in. Also, I wanted to extend a warm welcome for you to come to SIG Node and express your use cases and needs. I just wanted to give a little context that like the type of thing you're looking for node lifecycle, the project has, including some of my Red Hat colleagues, have presented the ideas in the past to various SIGs, and the node maintenance operator you linked, I'm pretty sure Michael Gugino at the time was a Red Hat employee who presented that to probably SIG node and SIG cluster lifecycle, basically trying to find a similar home that you were looking for. And then for context, there are adjacent projects in the ecosystem, like KubeVirt in particular is the one who really benefits from this ability to determine when a drain is happening so they can migrate a workload. So I think everyone appreciates the benefits that you're looking to achieve. The only thing I would caution, and just from my own experience where we've done stuff with our Red Hat hats on, is I really want to caution that when you get the thing into the Kubernetes project, like we have to be really careful on how we look at it from a security lens standpoint. Most every version of this type of solution I've seen has been subject to some type of trampoline attack, which is probably why I might hold scars. And so when folks come forward for a presentation on the idea, I get very anxious on like the escalation vectors that might come in. I don't know today for Carpenter what type of like security view you've done or haven't done, or even narrowed into this use case. I see benefits in the SIG being able to do stuff to support you, because getting something like this integrated into, say, the node restriction admission plugin would be really beneficial. But I just want to caution, like, it has been an idea that's come forward many times. It's hard to get the security model perfect. And that would be an area where if you could give your own perspective or guidance on it, I think the community at large would appreciate. But that's probably the last thing I'll say. I don't know, Sergey, if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to extend it a little bit on, like, I totally agree with what you said, that we may need to have some home for extended APIs, but it's really hard to find common solution for so many scenarios. And Node also became more and more proactive in that, like with a feature like graceful termination. And we entered the space of draining Node ourselves from kubelet. And also we have in Node problem detector, for instance, some people trying to come and convert Node problem detector into controllers that will start killing nodes, which is also another controllers that we need to like beware about and like protect ourselves from not putting too much functionality into different places and try to align. So like, please come and discuss scenarios, and we should agree on something. And James, I wanted to ask you a question. You said that you don't like the idea that implementation and labels leave the same project. Are you advocating on removing autoscaler from Kubernetes, or just I just want to make sure that you're not meaning that?
Yeah. No, I'm not meaning that. I'm just saying that the more people are there, the more projects are there, the more discussion is there, then it's easier it is going to be to support all of us going in the long term, because we can't carry these sorts of burdens by ourselves, right? Especially for a long period of time. Building a consensus and getting to a good spot will make sure that we don't land up in trouble going further, right? Like there's this African proverb, right? Like if you want to go far, further, then go together, right? So.
Yeah, we had some success with moving container runtime functionality out of Kubernetes project, which forced us to have APIs and discuss APIs more explicitly rather than tie them to implementation very tightly. So I wouldn't surprised by that idea, but I want to make sure that we are not discussing it right now.
Sounds good. Okay, last call on the topic. Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Going once, going twice.
Let's have one macro question, maybe, Ellison. I'm sorry.
Go, Mike. Go ahead.
Do you have use cases where it's inappropriate from a security model for the cluster to actually initiate the drain or disruption? Am I alone in that as a power that is not often wanted universally? Or for the user community that you've worked with, it's okay for that disruption to be triggered from the data plane of the cluster?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely new. It's a new, classically, this is driven by a cloud provider node group and some implementation external. We found that it really resonates with customers. Like, for example, we have a finalizer on node claim, and you can delete the node claim and it'll cascade and delete to delete the instance. And that is a super privileged action. That means that if you have RBAC permission to delete a node claim CRD, then you can trigger cord and drain, you can knock out a node. So I think that we definitely have had to confront some of these security questions and have gone through pretty extensive security review. I wouldn't be shocked if you guys have learnings. I haven't heard of the trampoline.
Yeah, like one thing I'm curious if your community has hit is where you have environments that might be a single node, let's say where you have a converged control plane and worker role responsibility, or even classical kubeadm clusters where you have control host and worker hosts all being managed in the same shared network or shared CNI. Like the ability to signal a drain of a control host is a nice way to bring down your cluster in an easy fashion. And I'm not sure if the Carpenter user community and the types of clusters they were interacting with, where traditionally the control planes are externalized, has maybe encountered as many of those problems. But that's just some of the issues I think would be unique to reason through when bringing to the SIG at large. And I just wanted to surface that here, which was that's one of the difficulties that can make it hard to universalize the solution. Because like I said, if you can signal a drain of all three control hosts at the same time, you've basically DOS the cluster.
Right.
Yeah, and there is a bootstrapping problem with Carpenter where if you run it in the cluster and you run it on its own compute, then you can get yourself stuck if all three replicas are gone for any reason. So that is, I think classically, yes, like we do expect Carpenter to run elsewhere. Like COPS, for example, runs Carpenter on the control plane nodes. Those control plane nodes join the cluster, but they're not responsible for provisioning. So the control plane nodes aren't provisioned by Carpenter. We have had users asking to have all of their cluster capacity provisioned by Carpenter. And in that case, you would need like a CAPI style management cluster to do kind of the remote control style approach.
Yeah. So I think I just wanted to make sure that was appreciated here. It's like when looking at this project from the Kubernetes landscape, it was being respectful to those who had control hosts and workers converged, or maybe other highly sensitive role hosts, where if we put an API inside the data plane that says do the drain, it sounds trivial, but then it immediately becomes an attack vector. And so that's just one thing I think as a project as a whole, and hopefully this SIG, we're all reasoning through that there are a lot of different presentations at Kubernetes, and to be in the project and in the core, we want to make sure we're as satisfactorily to that set as possible.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I'm hopeful that we can work around that it may even be easier to work around it, like you mentioned with the node restriction namespace, or to reject requests to do this kind of thing if you do have the control host label or whatever controls that we'd like to build, I think in some sense it may only be possible to build the security model you're looking for by being part of the core project.
Possibly. That's why I was just putting it out there. It's like that's been the problem that hadn't been confronted. And so as a follow-on for you, as you look to engage the SIG, if you can come like proactively from that perspective, it might smooth discussions.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think between COPS and between support for other cloud providers, I think we'll be able to cover more of these kind of scenarios, I think. Thanks, Derek. Rian, you have 13 minutes. Sorry.
Not a problem. I don't even need 13. On a very lighter note, we have a promotion PR, which is the test is running flake-free. There was a flake, but it was something else that was breaking. So they're busy fixing that. It's not related to our test. So our test is not flaking. There's some other issues with storage that's being exposed by this. So no worries there. The PR promotion PR is ready to be approved, but it still needs to set a week. Next week is the week before KubeCon. Test freeze is the week after KubeCon. So I'll really appreciate if today somebody would be willing to stick an LTTM and approve on it. And then the second PR is the removal of the endpoints from the list, like I always do, which is happiness, only 20 endpoints remaining on that list, which we hope to have done by the next release. So end of March next year, we should be absolutely 100% conformance tested.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll take care of both. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dennis. Then the second is just for information. So at the moment, I'm not sure if it's exactly applicable to this group, but as conformance is being hosted here, when you want to submit a PR to the CNCF conformance repo, if you need to clone it down, it's more than 7 gigs at the moment, which is a bit of an unpleasant end user experience. So we created an archive repo already. So the strategy is going to be to basically delete all folders prior to 123 and all Git history, clear all old files. And we'll have in the README a reference that if you're looking for anything older, it's over there. So it's already fully backed up. There's nothing going to get lost. We just need to make the end user experience better. We also added a bot function that do not allow anything other than only the 2 files that is exactly required, or the 4 files that's required for conformance, because people submitted their Git logs, or their Sonoboy logs, everything that they could possibly find that tried to convince their conformance is real. So we blocked it down and already seeing a slower increase in size of the repo. Just for information.
Perfect. Sounds good. Sounds like the right thing.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
3 minutes flat.
Done.
Okay, so who's coming to KubeCon?
Yes, I'll be there.
Okay,
I'll be there.
Anybody else? Okay.
I'll be there too.
Sounds good, David.
Yeah, I'll be there too.
Looking forward to it, Dwight. Okay, bye everyone. See you in 2 weeks.
I'll answer Victor. Had a question on chat. Is there any Kubernetes full stack disaster recovery best practice document or anything close? Not as far as I know from the Kubernetes project. What you'll find is that each distribution vendor or cloud provider probably has their own entirely opinionated way to do such things. That's what I think. Any other opinions here?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.